Dr. Griffin make a few announcements?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do that. So while we wait for our speaker to get back on, Dr. Pat Griffin has a few announcements to make, and then we'll move on to the graduate student presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Pritchard. And actually, I just wanted to inform our members, in case you have not heard, that within the past year, we've had 2 former members to transition. On December 25th of 2021, Professor Emeritus of Psychology, Dr. Phil Trapp passed. Dr. Trapp was a past president of the Arkansas Psychological Association. He also wrote the licensure law for psychology. He was a pioneer in the field of clinical psychology here in Arkansas. And on April the 30th of this year, Dr. Frank Slavic died in Hot Springs, and he was actually interred just this past Friday at the Fort Smith National Veterans Cemetery. So those of us who have been around for a few years will recall both Dr. Trapp and Dr. Slavic. And we acknowledge their contribution to the field. Thank you, Eric.
All right, well, thank you. And what we'll do now is we'll transition. We'll have Laura Rom. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Rome.
Rome, okay. Yes, well, and she'll be giving the graduate student presentation titled Climate Change and Hurricanes, a Study on Disaster Relief, Work on Mental Health. And since you're the only graduate presentation, we're going to allot 30 minutes, but if you, about 15 minutes to talk, 15 minutes to ask questions, but if you want to take a little bit more time to do your talk, feel free to do so. And then I'll get started with some questions about what the research process has been like during the last couple of years, as we're all getting used to doing a lot more things from a distance and online in general. And then we'll open up the floor to questions from the rest of the attendees. So we're excited to have you. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right.
I'm sorry, Dr. Pritchard, I'm sorry, Laura, if
Yes.
I could just interject for a second, because I didn't make the announcement. I noticed that people are putting their names in the chat. Thank you so much for doing that. Again, that's our way of keeping attendance. So if you haven't put your name in the chat, after you come back from lunch, please do that. This session right here is for CE credit. So yes, thank you for putting your name in the chat. And as Mary Ann Seaburn mentioned, yes, thank you, Dr. Griffin, for honoring and giving us the names of those that have transitioned, because we certainly want to honor their legacy and contribution. Okay, thank you. I just want to make that announcement. Okay, Laura.
All right, thank you. I did learn that I was the only person presenting, so I added a few more slides. There was a lot of information to cram into like the initial 5-minute video that I made, so I added a little bit more. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've never just used a single monitor. I don't have my second monitor with me, so it might take me a second to do this correctly. Okay, I'm going to share a portion and sorry. Oh, that's not what I want to do. Sorry, y'all. Never done this. Slideshow presenter. Okay. Can y'all see the right thing?
Yes.
Yes, that's
Okay,
perfect.
awesome. Thank you for bearing with me for a second. So my project is titled Climate Change and Hurricanes, a study on disaster relief worker mental health. And this project was primarily put together by myself, but I had a lot of help from someone at my school named Kaylin Menard. I had a lot of help from a colleague and friend, Stephanie Saltzman, who's at LSU, and my advisor's name is Dr. Margaret Smith, and she's been really helpful throughout this process. And just a little background, I'm from the New Orleans area, so hurricanes are such a huge part of my life. So that's one of the things that inspired me. So the agenda really quickly, I'm going to give you some context. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I did method wise. I'm going to explain the results, go through the discussion, and tell you a little bit about some future directions. So to start off, hurricanes in the Gulf Coast. Though we're all kind of familiar with what hurricanes are, I wanted to introduce a little bit more information. So the Hurricane Research Division has defined a major hurricane as a storm that reaches a maximum wind speed of 1 minute surface wind of approximately 111 miles per hour. So on that hurricane scale that we hear about, that would be a category 3, 4, or 5. There have been several major hurricanes of the 21st century that have hit the Gulf Coast, and some of these storms have been extremely devastating to residents because sometimes these hurricanes will hit back to back. For example, Hurricane Dennis struck the Florida Panhandle just about a year after Hurricane Ivan did. So while people were still recovering, they were hit again. So that means insurance is going up. People are continuing to grieve the loss of people or items. So we can't really pick when these things happen. It's also important to note that even when a hurricane doesn't make landfall as a major storm, there could still be flooding, tornadoes, and power outages. And I think recently, or somewhat recently, that happened in Galveston, where it wasn't, maybe it was a hurricane category 1, and it flooded and damaged so many homes and places. I also listed a few of the major hurricanes that have hit somewhat recently. Katrina, Rita, Wilma, etc. Okay, so first responders. Some background information on first responders includes the following. First responders are typically those first people in the scene. They might go into a situation with little to no background information on what's actually happening. So if a first responder is living in a disaster zone, they might not have access to internet at the time, their power might be out, so they might not know exactly what's happening in certain areas. First responders tend to various events, including accidents where victims are harmed, fires or explosions, violent confrontations, failed resuscitation attempts, and disaster relief, which is my focus. There are also various risks for harm associated with this type of work. So first responders are constantly putting themselves at risk of injury, death, mental health symptoms, and constant exposure to critical incidents. Disaster relief first responders. So similarly to what I was just saying, these are individuals who respond to hurricanes, and they really range in roles and experience. So some first responders might be affiliated with the military, or they might be firefighters, but also some hurricane relief responders or disaster relief responders are volunteers with little to no experience in this field. After a disaster, first responders are at an increased risk of developing symptoms of PTSD, along with various other mental health symptoms. When a first responder is physically ill or injured, lives in that same disaster-stricken area, or ends up fearing for their life during crisis, their distress might be much more serious than someone who hasn't had any health issues while engaging in their response efforts, or didn't lose a home during their response efforts. And according to one study that was conducted pretty shortly after Katrina, 93% of surveyed hurricane relief workers experienced pretty significant damage to their home. So it's likely that those individuals face a lot more distress than people who might have come in town from other states or cities. Mental health and disaster. Hurricane, oops, looks like I may have messed up my notes. Sorry, y'all. Mental health and disaster. So there are always going to be negative mental health outcomes when disaster hits, especially due to the nature of disaster. A lot of times these happen out of the blue. We're not exactly, we might not be fully planning what's going to happen. We don't know what the outcomes are going to be. So that increases the chance of negative mental health outcomes. 70% of first responders surveyed after Hurricane Katrina actually witnessed injury or death. And as someone who's lived in the New Orleans area for my whole life, I've heard that many first responders are still struggling with PTSD as a result of some of these things. But also after a disaster, during a disaster, there's a sense of community and morale when people are kind of conquering this together. And we often see an even stronger sense of social support. So in situations where individuals come together and help each other, there's actually research that shows that individuals will experience fewer mental health outcomes or fewer negative mental health outcomes. Okay. PTSD prevalence. So first responders experience a prevalence of PTSD ranging from 8% to 32%, compared to the 6.8 to 7.8 lifetime prevalence of PTSD in average citizens and 17% prevalence in active duty military. Resilience. As a little bit of a refresher on resilience, and for the purpose of this study, resilience is an individual's ability to adapt and survive after an adverse or traumatic event. Resilience is more specifically the first responders' ability to adapt during and after hurricane relief. So individuals with higher levels of resilience will be able to overcome both expected and unexpected adverse experiences. Individuals with medium levels of resiliency have the ability to overcome some adverse experiences, but may struggle at times due to social or environmental factors. Individuals with low levels of resiliency likely struggle in the face of adversity. There are many characteristics that play a role in levels of resilience, including how the individual views change or stress as a challenge or as an opportunity. Commitment, recognition of limits to control, engaging the support of others, and there are also plenty of other factors that contribute to this. Resilience in first responders. Disaster disrupts the lives of first responders and community members alike due to the disaster's element of surprise. To overcome the element of surprise, resilience is the factor that causes individuals to bounce back after the disaster. Higher levels of resilience in first responders are linked to positive coping, higher levels of social support, and personal competence. When there are higher levels of each of these factors, there will likely be an absence of PTSD or lower levels of PTSD symptoms. Several individual characteristics improve the chances of maintaining higher levels of resilience, and that would be physical strength, good health, higher levels of intelligence, mastery of the environment, and perceived social support. Social support. So, social support includes the quality and function of social relationships. The absence of social support has actually been linked to PTSD development after a traumatic event. Whereas the presence of social support is actually shown to improve trauma recovery. A study conducted on firefighters showed that firefighters who utilize the support of their own community to overcome adversity can actually counteract the negative effects of stress. So social support can aid in the management of both stress, and it can help with both physical stress and emotional stress. Social support may typically be seen as a protective factor. However, during hurricanes, there's a high chance that first responders are being separated from their support systems. There's been research conducted on social support in natural disasters that's indicated that lower levels of social support during disasters are associated with increased risk for PTSD symptoms. Okay, so here's my methods and results. Okay, so I went through a lot of literature. I found some measures that I liked. I used a demographic survey. So the demographic survey included standard demographic information that we would typically collect, including age, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, but I also included questions about number of hurricanes responded to, states in which hurricane response efforts were conducted, and mental health history. So I asked questions about whether the individuals had ever been diagnosed with a mental health disorder, or if any of the individuals had been diagnosed with PTSD in the past. I also used the PTSD checklist civilian version because it's really well established. I've used it throughout my clinical work, and it's been normed across populations. I also use the Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale to assess how individuals felt about specific situations in the past month that were related to resilience. So I also use this because it was normed and validated on just a wide variety of people, including the US population, people who have a diagnosis of PTSD, primary care patients, etc. And I also use the interpersonal support evaluation list shortened formed, which again was something that was normed and validated internationally. So I thought it would be a pretty good measure to use, and I found it in plenty of the articles that I reviewed. These are my research questions. Do disaster relief first responders experience lower levels of trauma symptoms with higher levels of social support post-hurricane or torrential flooding relief? And do disaster relief first responders experience lower levels of trauma symptoms whenever higher levels of resilience are endorsed post-hurricane or torrential flooding relief? Hypotheses. Hypothesis number 1. Disaster relief first responders will endorse lower levels of trauma symptoms when they experience higher levels of social support. Hypothesis number 2. Disaster relief first responders will endorse lower levels of trauma when they experience higher levels of resilience. Participants. So 187 people started the screening process. I had a screening question, and then I also had a couple of other criteria that needed to be met. And then 129 individuals completed the entire questionnaire and completed the study. So 58 people didn't meet criteria for the study or prematurely discontinued. Findings. It was hypothesized that hurricane or disaster relief first responders would endorse lower levels of trauma symptoms or symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if they endorsed higher levels of social support. Scores ranging between 17 and 29 on the PCLC are considered little to no severity, 30 to 44 considered to be moderate to moderately high, and 45 to 85 is considered to be high severity. So the sum of PCL scores were calculated to determine severity. Overall, 74 participants had scores at or below 29, which was little to no severity. 30 participants had scores between 30 and 44, or moderate to moderately high severity. And 25 participants had scores between 45 and 85, or high severity. The interpersonal support evaluation list, shortened formed, has scores ranging from 12 to 48. Scores between 12 and 24 indicated lower levels of perceived social support, while scores between 25 and 48 indicated moderate to high levels of perceived social support. For each participant, the sum of the ISEL scores were calculated. Overall, 4 participants endorsed low levels of perceived social support, and I thought, wow, this is really great. Only 4 people out of this whole sample endorsed low levels of social support. And 125 participants endorsed moderate to high levels of social support. So what did these findings mean? A Pearson correlation coefficient was computed to assess the relationship between PTSD symptoms and social support. There was a moderately strong negative correlation between the two variables. The relationship was significant. So that means that hypothesis number 1 was supported. Lower levels of PTSD symptoms were correlated with increased endorsement of social support. Findings continued. It was hypothesized that hurricane and disaster relief first responders would endorse lower levels of trauma symptoms or symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if they endorsed higher levels of resilience. The CD risk, or Connor-Davidson Resilience Scale, has 25 questions, and total scores can range between 0 and 100. Scores that are closer to 100 are associated with higher levels of resilience, while scores closer to 0 are associated with lower levels of resilience. So for the purpose of this study, scores between 0 and 20 will be considered extremely low. Scores between 21 and 40 will be low. Scores between 41 and 60 will be low to moderate. Scores between 61 and 80 will be moderate to moderately high. And scores between 81 and 100 will be high. One participant reported extremely low levels of resilience. 2 participants made up the low resilience group. 19 participants were included in the low to moderate group. 64 participants endorsed moderate to moderately high levels of resilience, and 43 participants made up the high resilience group. So what do these findings mean? A Pearson correlation coefficient was computed to assess the relationship between PTSD symptoms and resilience. There was a moderately strong negative correlation between the 2 variables. The relationship was significant. So this means that hypothesis number 2 was supported. Lower levels of PTSD symptoms were correlated with increased endorsement of resilience. And I wanted to include some other notable findings. This was one that was pretty striking to me, and I have some included in the discussion as well. But in this study, 90 participants endorsed being heterosexual, 12 endorsed being bisexual, 6 endorsed being lesbian, 3 endorsed being gay, 8 endorsed being pansexual, and 4 participants listed other and wrote in asexual, demisexual, or none of the above. There was a prefer not to say option that was clicked by 7 participants. An independent t-test was run between sexual orientation and PTSD scores. There were 2 groups included in this analysis under the sexual orientation category. So that was the heterosexual group and the sexual minority group. PTSD scores and sexual orientation groups. A Welch's correctional t-test revealed that there was significantly lower PTSD scores for the heterosexual group compared to the sexual minority group. PTSD scores separated by sexual orientation. There was a main effect of sexual orientation with the sexual minority group having higher PTSD scores. Resilience scores and sexual orientation groups. An independent t-test was run between sexual orientation and resiliency scores. An independent samples t-test revealed that members of the heterosexual group have significantly higher resiliency scores compared to the sexual minority group. And resiliency scores separated by sexual orientation. There was the main effect of sexual orientation with the heterosexual group having higher resiliency scores. An independent t-test was also run between sexual orientation groups and social support. The t-test revealed no significant difference. And here we go with the discussion. Okay, so research question number 1 asked, do disaster relief first responders experience lower levels of trauma symptoms with higher levels of social support post-hurricane or torrential flooding relief? Consistent with prior research, higher levels of social support were associated with lower levels of trauma and PTSD symptoms in disaster relief first responders. Research question number 2 asked, do disaster relief responders experience lower levels of trauma symptoms when higher levels of resilience are endorsed post-hurricane or torrential flooding relief? Consistent with prior research, higher levels of resilience were associated with lower levels of trauma PTSD symptoms in disaster relief first responders. So here's my demographics discussion. I added a few things here that I didn't include in my previous section. So results also showed that participants who were not married or no longer married endorsed more symptoms of PTSD, lower levels of social support, and even lower levels of resilience. This suggests that partnerships may improve the disaster relief first responders' well-being during and after hurricane response. These findings are also consistent with those that were found with active duty military personnel and research that was done previously. Results also showed that participants who identified as sexual minorities endorsed more symptoms of PTSD and lower levels of resilience compared to the heterosexual group. Previous research conducted on sexual minorities has identified that sexual minorities are at greater risk for child abuse growing up and sexual assault compared to those who do not identify as a sexual minority. This suggests that there may be more stressors associated with being a sexual minority that negatively affect how an individual experiences and recovers after a Criterion A event. Further, the results also showed that participants who reported a history of PTSD in that initial demographic screener or another mental illness endorsed more symptoms of PTSD. Future directions. So this is the big part, and it's something that I think I'll always be excited about because I think there's always stuff to do when it comes to natural disaster, climate change, but this is just kind of the basic for me. I want to be able to utilize this survey, this questionnaire, and other geographic regions where hurricanes hit. So maybe the East Coast or the West Coast, but maybe even other countries at some point. I want to compare the data collected related to hurricanes with other natural disasters. So now I'm in another geographic location, being in Arkansas. So maybe in the future, I can collect some information on tornadoes or ice storms or something like that. I would like to work on developing a resilience and social support scale that are a little bit more updated. Some of the questions specifically with the social support scale asked things about, I think one question asked, do you feel comfortable asking a friend to go to the movies or something like that? But given the nature of COVID, some people still might not feel comfortable doing that. So naturally their answer might have been a little bit lower. I would also like to conduct similar research with other populations just to learn a little bit about resilient social support and PTSD. So I found some information about sexual minorities and those factors, so maybe continuing that research. I have already done a few things, so I didn't put them in future directions, but I've actually called someone who is running for Congress in Louisiana who also has an interest in hurricane relief. So I'm hoping to work with her if she's elected to hopefully get some mental health funding to train people in evidence-based treatments for trauma. And now is time for questions. And I also wanted to show y'all I have my references, and I wanted to dedicate this to my grandfather who passed away over the weekend.
Well, to start, I want to say we're really sorry for your loss, and we really appreciate that you're here. And I think your presentation today, he would be very proud of you, because I want to say that this was an excellent presentation.
Thank
And
you.
before I open up the floor to questions, I actually want to make several comments about why I'm really happy that this was the student presentation, because the topic of the conference is the future of psychology, including both technology and equity, diversity, and inclusion. And there are a couple aspects of this that are the future of psychology. First and foremost, climate change is an increasing reality. And one thing that we maybe aren't ready for as psychology is we are going to have to deal, as psychologists, deal with the psychological effects of climate change. And you're already doing this because you're dealing with first responders to a climate disaster. And I think going forward in the future, as a future topic, how is climate change, the effect on first responders and the effect on population, how is that going to affect psychology? I was also really, the finding you found about sexual minorities and the greater level of PTSD symptoms and lower levels of resiliency was really striking in light of an exercise we did yesterday with on through the cultural humility talk, where we went through the circle of privilege. And I think one of the most pernicious things about privilege is people who have it, oftentimes the biggest privilege you have is not realizing you have how privileged you are, right? So the idea that people who are gay or bisexual, lesbian, who are first responders, they're doing a public service, they're doing very important work, and yet they're more susceptible to PTSD or trauma symptoms and might have less social support while they're first responders. And that's just another example of privilege in action in a negative way for people who are heterosexual, having those more kind of protective factors. And it fits in really well with the diversity, equity, and inclusion theme. So there are a couple aspects of this talk that I think will really fit in very well with what we're doing. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions, and then I want to open up questions to the other attendees. And we want to make this kind of a conversation. We don't want to grill you. So we're happy to have you. We're not here to put you on the spot, but I do have a couple of questions, and then I'll let other people ask questions. So mine's kind of a two-parter. One has to do with the research, and one has to do with your experience as a student over the last couple of years, because just seeing a grad student who's going through a doctoral program during the pandemic, how just I know it's not exactly directly related to research, but how has that experience been? And has that changed how you use technology? And the way that falls into the research was, did you use technology or the internet or online resources to collect your data? And how did you find your sample?
Yeah, so lots of different parts to that. I'm going to try to cover all of it, but being a student for one during the pandemic and being, I don't know, maybe it was my third year in my program when maybe third or fourth, something around there. I honestly didn't expect it to be as intense as it was. I didn't expect to be doing a year of virtual work, but I think luckily I had a lot of support. So I felt really comfortable transitioning to virtual platforms. But when it came to my research, I knew that like this was going to be a pretty difficult population to engage with because I'm not a part of that community. I'm not a first responder. I've done my own work at home. Like after Hurricane Ida, I helped out around the house last year, but it's hard to engage with the community that you're not a part of. And due to the nature of the pandemic, I wasn't able to really engage in person with those communities and kind of show them who I was. So I collected all of my data through SurveyMonkey, but I was able to engage with Facebook group moderators. So there were some pretty big groups in Texas and Florida. And I got to know the point person for the group. And that individual shared some of the information for me and gave me a platform to introduce myself online. And I think that's how I was really able to recruit a lot of people, working on gaining the trust of that one person and communicating that way. I was also lucky to have a pretty good connection with like the Louisiana Psychological Association, and my study was shared through them because there are a lot of psychologists in Louisiana who engage in disaster relief. So there was a lot of sharing and word of mouth. So I would say I was incredibly lucky, but I guess the thing that worried me the most is due to some IRB issues. My IRB was taking a while. I think I probably waited for about 3 months. I was hoping to start collecting data before hurricane season, but I actually started collecting data like right in the middle of hurricane season in June. So that was kind of difficult. I don't know if I touched everything that you asked on, but if you wouldn't mind repeating any parts that I might have missed.
Oh, you did a good job answering my question. I know there are a couple of questions in the chat, and if anybody else has any questions, feel free to ask. But let's see, it looks like Kyla and Alan both have a couple of questions.
Okay. reading those right now. Yes, this is for Kyla's question. So everyone was instructed to respond just related to their experiences with hurricane relief as a first responder, not related to any other first responder work, which is kind of difficult. And there was a lot of explaining involved in my consent forms and information forms that I gave them virtually. So that's how I was able to communicate that. But I know there's never really a way to tell whether it worked out that way. So I guess that could be a limitation since I wasn't there in person and explaining it. Let's see. Sorry, I'm like reading through to make sure I'm catching the questions. I appreciate the feedback. And Alan, I appreciate your comment as well. Let's see. So the question of is prior mental health the prior mental health problem a risk or limitation of job for performance? I think that can be looked at both ways. I know that there are a lot of people who are engaging in disaster relief work that have a history of a mental illness and they're getting their job done. They just might not have the supports in place to get treatment when they need it. So that's something that I was hoping to shed light on with my my project as a whole, to get some funding to get those things in place for that trauma-informed treatment. But I mean, it could be a limitation. It could be something that interacts with job performance, because during hurricane relief, I mean, I've heard some of my younger brother's stories, and he works for energy, and he was sent to Florida one year, and he said that he was the first person to see a deceased body in a building. And I know that that affected him, and he had to reach out to his company and just let him know that this was a struggle for him. So I think that when people don't feel comfortable reaching out, it could become a problem. So that's why I think larger companies or fire stations or police departments or anywhere should be having these conversations about mental health with their employees, with these people who are so important to the community, to make sure that not just their physical health is tended to, but their mental health. Let's see, I'm going to go to the next one. Yes, with the piece on like including those who are married, or if they're currently undergoing some difficulties with their marriage, I think that is important. And some of the demographic information that I found showed that that does really impact social support, and people who have been experiencing difficulties in their marriage or relationships do have a higher rate of PTSD symptoms endorsed. And it looks like that's all of the questions, but I definitely encourage anyone that has a question to ask. I love talking about this stuff. It's important to me, and I think that we rely on disaster relief workers so much for a variety of different things. And it's hard to know that sometimes these individuals don't get the help that they need because they either don't know that it's out there, or there just aren't enough resources.
So actually, I have two questions. Well, for you and for actually everybody, I want to open my questions up to everybody on the floor here, because I'm an experimental psychologist. So sometimes my knowledge about clinical psychology, I can teach, intro psych and get through the section on mental health. So one thing I'm really curious about, and anybody can answer this, is sometimes my understanding is that clinical psychologists can act as kind of psychological first responders. And when that's the case, do we see similar sorts of risk factors for psychological first responders, people going in to offer psychological services with trauma? And my second question is going back to the finding that I just found really striking with, again, the sexual minorities showing more trauma. I just wonder in general, is there broader research showing that people who are members of marginalized communities, when they're first responders, police officers, firefighters, is that an added risk factor for all those types of traumas for different types of marginalized groups? Because that idea is just really striking to me. The idea that person who's a public servant who has a risky job is facing additional dangers or challenges because of their identity. So I just wonder if there's more research on that. So anybody can answer those questions.
I have thoughts. I can go and tell you a little bit about my experience with that second question, but I actually didn't find a lot of information on sexual minorities and disaster relief work. So that's kind of one of the reasons why it might be a future direction of mine, because I think there needs to be more light shed on that because of the stressors that those individuals go through on a daily basis. One of the things that I was thinking is, if you are a sexual minority and you are working with a group of people in disaster relief who don't identify the same way, you might be a part of that community, but you might not feel as much of a part of the community as maybe some of the other people around you. So that's my thought. I didn't run into a lot of literature. I predominantly found literature on sexual minorities as a whole, but not specifically like first responders or nurses or doctors. So it was very broad. And then for the psychological first responders, I mean, I definitely think that as psychologists and mental health workers, we're all susceptible to the same sorts of things. Like if we experience a criterion A trauma while responding in a hurricane zone, or working with someone like right as hurricanes are happening, we too can experience PTSD symptoms. Or if we're working post-hurricane with an individual, we might experience some like secondary traumatic stress symptoms or vicarious trauma through some of the things that we hear about. So that just brings me to like, who's going to take care of the psychologists and the mental health workers who are going through this stuff? I don't want it to be a cycle. So they're all things that I'm thinking about, but I also think that some people here might have something to add to that. I'm not sure.
Yeah, does anyone else have some experience with that? All right. So I think then I'll ask one more question. I want to make sure that we're using up enough time for our supposed to be a CE. So you talk a little about next steps. What's the next step for this study? Are you working on a manuscript? Are you submitting for publication? Are you looking to replicate first?
Yeah, I'm actually looking for journals right now to submit to, and I'm still in the process of getting this into an article form, but I'm working really closely with my chair in my program to figure out what journal's best. There aren't a lot of specific disaster relief mental health journals out there, but there's a lot of international journals. So she's actually encouraging that I try to do that, which is a little scary to me because I'm pretty new to the research world. I'm coming from a PsyD program where my dissertation has been my primary research project. So it's a little scary, but that's the plan for me. And then also to continue similar to like what I was saying, just work on other disaster relief work, kind of do the study with other types of disasters that aren't just hurricanes, and then continue working with people who are in Congress to make sure that mental health funding for hurricanes and natural disasters are there, because right now I just there are people in New Orleans who I've worked with when I was living in New Orleans who are still experiencing PTSD from Hurricane Katrina, and that was like 16 years ago. So that's what I want to do. And it might be ambitious, but someone's gotta try to do it.
Yeah, ambitious is good. Ambitious is good. Does anybody else have any other comments, questions? And actually, I have a technical question for Kyla and Eric too, because we were going to have 2 student presentations and we had one. Do we have to go up until 2 o'clock in order for it to qualify for a CE?
I think it would be ideal. I don't know that we necessarily have to, but there were another couple of at least comments in the chat. I know Tisha had a question about wondering if there are I don't know if you all already addressed it, such as stoicism and cultural factors that are higher in disaster relief workers. And then there's a comment about Kevin Rowell. Of course, yeah, he's done a lot in this space.
Well, and similar to what Kyla was saying, I thought Gary asked a really good question about mental health and effect on job performance as well.
Let's see. Yeah, that was a good question about prior mental health. I mean, that's definitely something that I could talk more about. I mean, I really only have what I collected from my demographic survey. I can actually, I won't share my screen or anything, but I can pull up really quick and maybe I can possibly give you some information on what that statistic actually was for mental health, because I know I didn't elaborate on that as much just due to time constraints. Let's see. Okay, let me see. I'm pulling it up right now. Okay, so I will just give you this information kind of briefly for history of PTSD and mental illness. So each participant was asked about history of PTSD and mental health. And what I did was I ran an independent t-test between history of PTSD and reported symptoms of PTSD. So the symptoms that they recorded on the PCLC. So a Levine's test of homogeneity was violated when I did this, and I used a Welch's correctional t-test. And the t-test revealed that those who reported having a history of PTSD reported significantly higher PTSD scores than those who didn't have a history of PTSD. And I also ran a t-test again between history of mental illness and reported symptoms of PTSD. And once again, Levine's test of homogeneity was violated. So therefore, Welch's correctional t-test was used, and that t-test revealed that those who have had a previous history of mental health had significantly higher PTSD scores compared to those who hadn't ever experienced a diagnosis related to mental health. So there was a main effect of PTSD, with the history of PTSD group having higher PTSD scores, and same with the mental health group. So there was a main effect of PTSD with the history of mental health group having higher PTSD symptoms. So that's the information that I collected on mental health and PTSD demographic wise. But I mean, I'm just thinking a little bit about how mental health can really impact the day, especially if someone's experiencing symptoms of PTSD like nightmares or trouble falling asleep or something like that. That could really impact the job, especially if you're working with something dangerous like live wires or going through water, operating heavy machinery. So I would say that if some of these symptoms aren't managed very well, then yeah, it could definitely impact job performance. I think a lot of people would agree with that. But there's definitely more to learn. I'm really curious about which specific symptoms were experienced more by first responders. I didn't look into that. I mainly just looked at the total score of each PCL. So it would be interesting to know whether people were experiencing higher levels of nightmares or difficulties with relationships or something like that as a result of the Criterion A event that they experienced. Looking at some of the comments now. I will definitely look into the journal that Alan commented. And I like Dr. Dean's comment about looking at first responders who've also had military combat experience. And there were actually some people, I did ask everyone who completed this study what their role was in disaster relief. And there were a chunk of people who endorsed being in the military. And since we have a total of 10 minutes, I can actually go through and list how many of each group were completed the study, if y'all are interested in that. So there were 3 firefighters, 7 police officers, 11 EMTs, 1 doctor, 6 nurses, 14 mental health workers, 18 volunteers, 1 person who was in the Department of Transportation, 2 outdoor maintenance workers. So that would be like garbage disposal and those sorts of things. 4 people said that they were in the military, and 34 people were kind of lumped into this like disaster management, like before, during, after category. And some people reached out to explain what their title was to make sure that they would qualify. And then I also had 27 people who listed other, and others ranged from like just specific agency names like United Way to someone listed surgeon instead of doctor. And then some volunteers specifically listed what their job was. So that's what my sample looked like. I'm looking back at the comments again. And yes, I definitely agree that it is a challenge. It's probably a challenge to get first responders in. I haven't worked with a lot of first responders, but I have worked during one of my practicums in a PTSD clinic at a VA. And it was really challenging to get veterans to keep wanting to come back because like some of the symptoms were just very, very elevated. They weren't wanting to leave their house to come to treatment. And they were also really guarded because who am I? I've never been in the military before. So yeah, I definitely get that. And I that's one of the reasons why I think that mental health should be a hotter topic when it comes to relief work and disaster work, because the more we talk about it, the more normalized it'll be. So it won't be as stigmatizing to people who are worried about what it's going to look like to go in for treatment, or maybe they might not even be as guarded when they go in. Let's see. I think that that is a really good question. How important is it to have a contact that can vouch when you deal with populations like first responders? It was definitely a mixed bag for me. I did get a lot of responses who identified that they had responded in Texas after working really closely with a moderator of a Texas Facebook group. But also, when I just shared this into some other groups or asked or like left up a sign in like local coffee shops or something like that, I still had a decent amount of people responding. So it's really hard to tell, like it's hard to tell who was who. I did send it to a listserv for disaster relief, and it was a program in Colorado, and they just sent it out to a bunch of people studying disaster relief. And I don't think a lot of people completed that. I actually had people emailing me from like out of the country saying that I should have done my study a little bit differently, but I don't know. It's hard to say. But it was I remember getting an email from someone in England asking why I was doing this for just the Gulf South, because hurricanes happen everywhere. But I don't know what your experiences have been with like the Gulf Coast, but it's a very interesting community. I mean, it's not going to be the same as hurricanes anywhere else, I think, just because the sense of community is a little different. But I guess that might just be my opinion.
Yeah, well, I can also just relate to the experience of having somebody tell you should have done it differently. I think I have about like 13 or 14 papers now, and yeah, I think that's a familiar experience.
Yeah. But that's yeah, there probably were ways to do it differently. I definitely did what I could. And the support that I did get from certain groups, it was nice to hear. Like I worked with I had some people who were EMS like email me after because I included my email address, and they thanked me for doing this kind of work because they've never been a part of a study like this. So that was really nice. I was happy that I could get the ball rolling a little bit. So this is just a very first step, and I'm hoping to continue expanding on this. But it's something that I'm excited about. So yeah, I think in the next few years I can do some good work.
Yeah, it's a great first step, and I really like a couple things that Tisha said because it's definitely lays the groundwork for future research, like a pilot study, and it strikes me as the sort of thing that you can expand upon, seek funding for. As a student, yes, you do have to do something feasible, and like I said, it doesn't matter what you do. You can have like the best, most well-funded, brilliant design in the world, and somebody's going to come back and tell you should have done something differently in psychology. That's just the life we live.
Right.
So anyway, well, thank you very, very much. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And I also want to thank you for stretching it out and, getting us through that whole hour. Because like I said, this was meant to be 2 presentations, and you managed to fill an interesting and informative hour with 1 presentation. So we really appreciate it. And with that, I think I'll turn it over back to Kyla.
Yep. All right. Yes. Thank you, Laura. Thank you so much
you.
for presenting. And it's great to always know what folks are doing here in the state of Arkansas. And thank you, Dr. Pritchard, for moderating that. Yes, I see